Hello, Father Ovito here. Greetings from the land of Jesus. I'm here to explore more about Jerusalem. So please join me, and I have more videos to come. Mabuhay. God bless you, and muchas gracias. Dios les bendiga a todos. Hello, good morning to all of you. Father Ovito here. We just arrived here in MASADA National Park. This is one of the Herod's place. So I'll show you the place. And it's beautiful up here, but it's kind of hot. We are in the desert. God bless you, and enjoy a wonderful day to all of you. Bye. Shukran. This is the entrance of the MASADA National Park. It's a huge place. It's 1 hour and a half drive from Jerusalem. The MASADA archaeological experience. This is the place.
Aquela revolta contra os judeus, a família dos judeus liderou uma revolta contra eles e foi assim um milagre total, do início ao fim, como tudo aconteceu. Tá? É como se, por exemplo, como é um país, por exemplo, fosse uma e vencesse a Ucrânia. A Ucrânia, da Rússia, então, isso aconteceu. Homem de Deus. JP? The first one was in the early 1980s, I believe. This is now the third one. This one was upgraded about 20 years ago.
So I'll be riding the people car. So we're riding the people car.
It's a two-way ticket.
Thank you.
Hold on, let me just make sure. כן, בטוח? בסדר. לא, אני רוצה שיהיה
לא, כן, אני אעבוד לפי הגוף. כל קבוצה תצא כבוד. כל 20 כבוד.
תודה.
Después le explico. No, americanos 80, pero si son israelíes 120, nosotros más chaparritos somos. Claramente en el los esenios fueron autosuficientes, pero también criticaban o sea, todo trabajo, por supuesto. No producen todo. No,
مستر داوود ايوه معلش انا في البتاع ده ايوه
Cover their asses for all the right reasons.
لا خلاص طب كتر خيرك
When you think of the Dead Sea and the year before, you think of a small.
Brian, Brian, how far did you get?
This is going up now.
About to start going on.
I'll show you that whole view.
I got a phone call.
Because of me, because I asked it. If you're gonna blame somebody, blame me.
You did what you had to do.
Right. Yeah, I don't know whether they're going down.
Oh yeah, they're going down.
People are walking.
I'm not sure I would want to walk this in the heat of the day.
Right.
But they don't. So it opens at 8, or can you walk?
Oh no, it opens at 5.
Oh, it opens at 5.
It opens at 5.
Oh, okay.
And then depending on the heat, they'll close it at some point. In the summertime, it usually closes before 8. But now that it's September, I thought maybe they'd leave it open a little bit, but maybe not.
Well, I appreciate you said necessary.
I'm not trying to find out.
Did you buy that? Did you buy that now? Oh, yesterday. I was going to say it's quite relevant.
Yeah, I can use it as an excuse now.
Is Sister Marie with us?
I said she won't walk. She said I never walk there. I said you don't walk down the hill from
Yeah.
So we're getting to know each other already. It's only 10 days.
Wow, look at that.
She knows as much about myself.
أنا إذا من البلاتوت الخشبيات
Oh, okay.
Please be careful of the automatic doors. We hope you enjoy your visit.
Salt there?
Yeah, don't
Oh,
worry.
the Arabian.
Catch up dips.
Yes.
Right. Yeah,
Oh, from Mexico, isn't it?
So I guess if you pay
We just arrived.
Praise the Lord. We're going out that way, guys.
That's what I thought.
So we're going out.
Yikes. We're entangled.
Sorrasco.
So here's the view. Up on the mountain.
Yeah, this is just Mexican.
Porque eso viene de lo único es que no había motores, entonces era de pedal. La única.
You're welcome. Good day. América. Somos América también, California. Sí. It's kind of windy up here, but it's kind of cool. Which is good.
Seguimos despacito y nos juntamos donde está el Luis, ¿ok? Esto es lo más duro de hoy. Eso sí es metros.
Welcome to Masada. This is a huge place in the mountain. The flag of Israel. This is a huge place here.
This is a nice unexpected breeze. I called it in. You know, here? I'm gonna sit out. More room. Shore, passing by Qumran, passing by En-Gedi, and making our way to Masada. And that is where we are now. Okay? We'll just get rid of this little line that we used in our first class. We don't need that for now. Okay, so first of all, who can tell me what's wrong with that path? Or why does it look maybe a little ineffective?
Longer?
It's definitely longer. It's definitely not direct. Right. So why didn't we go this way? Exactly. Right? The cliffs that we saw from the bus as we were driving along the shore as talented as Abdullah might be, we don't want to go like this. Woo! And so this particular highway was built because of the nature of the landscape, and it was sort of the easiest descent on the way down. Clearly, 2,000 years ago, that was not a concern for the people living in this region. They didn't have Abdullah and the bus, right? So when you're on foot or when you're on, camelback, horseback, you can navigate the cliffs. There's always a way down. It might take a little while, but you can do it. So clearly they would have been going the direct route, and the direct route is short enough, right, as the crow flies, that it would only take about a day and a half of solid, serious walking to get to Masada. Right? We're not really that far from Jerusalem. It only took us about an hour on the bus. So you can imagine if you set out for a good long day of walking, a day and a half, like I said, you will get from Jerusalem to Masada. Why might that be relevant for a story taking place in the middle of the desert? Survival in what sense? Exactly. Meaning, how much do you need to bring with you if you're heading out into a journey in the desert? If you know that you have a destination waiting for you, it's only a day and a half walk away, then clearly you don't need to worry about packing, right? This is relevant because the story begins as a result of conflict. I know that's a big shock to all of you because we have no conflict in this part of the world, but it's a result of the conflict and the sort of a notion that maybe we need kind of a plan B when it comes to conflict, right? Conflict is clearly going to be centered where? In Jerusalem. That is the source of all conflict, as well as all inspiration, right? And all good things in this area, but it's also a source of conflict. So we go back about 200 years ago to the period of the Greek Empire, right, where the Hellenistic culture has come in and largely started to take over, extremely influential. There are many within the Judean world who are, let's just say, okay with a form of integration, perhaps even assimilation, into the Hellenistic culture. And clearly there are going to be those Jews who are opposed to any integration or any outside influence. And so we start to see already, as we talked about when we were in the southern excavations, a little bit of a rift, right, within that Jewish world. It just so happens that one of the more sort of vociferous and vocal opponents to the effect of the Greek culture was one of the priests that worked in the temple in Jerusalem, a guy by the name of Matityahu. Matityahu, a Hashmonai, Matityahu the Hasmonean. He was one of the priests, the head of the priestly families, and he lived in a town just outside of Jerusalem called Modi'in. Okay? He and his family, I won't go into all the details, you can read the books of the Maccabees, you'll figure it all out, but they start a rebellion against the Greek forces that were in and around the area of Jerusalem. And while the books of the Maccabees don't make it exactly clear sort of the whole context, we know a little bit more now thanks to the archaeological inscription that I showed you at the Israel Museum yesterday, right, which gives us some background, some context to that, because it wasn't just about a culture clash, but it was also because the Greek Empire had split into two. There was tremendous conflict between them. They were often trying to hoard land and resources, and there had been that moment where King Antiochus had sent Heliodorus to Jerusalem to raid the temple, right? Take all that tax money and bring it back. He got his butt kicked. There was a lot of tension, and so there's a little bit more aggressiveness on the part of the Greeks and a little bit more pushback on the part of the Jews. Okay? So we have the outbreak of the revolt, right? Well, eventually we know of as the Maccabee revolt. Technically, there was only one Maccabee. Who was the Maccabee? Judah the Maccabee. That was his nickname. But his family name was the Hasmoneans. It's called the Hasmonean Revolt. And after about 3 years of struggle between the Jews and the Greeks, the Jewish forces are able to eke out a small victory, which is quite surprising, right? You wouldn't have necessarily thought, right? The Israelite story is not really about kind of military superpower. The Greek Empire, on the other hand, is quite well known for their ability to conquer and subdue. So the Jews are able to declare victory in and around Jerusalem, which is important because the epicenter of that story, as we learned in the archaeological inscription, was the temple. right? The fact that they needed to get back control of the temple, and more importantly, because the temple had been nearly raided, it was defiled, it was not pure, and therefore not available for the sacrificial rituals. So they needed to have a whole cleanup, and they were able to purify the temple, and then they had a major public celebration, dedicating the temple back to God to sacrifice. How do we say dedication in Hebrew? Anybody remember? Chanukah, right? So that is the Chanukah celebration. All is well and good in the world, at least in the short term, in a very limited view. Okay? Now we have Hasmonean kings, who some of whom are also going to be priests. This is a slightly problematic episode, and you kind of know where that's going to go, because eventually that's going to become the corrupt element of Judean society, but we're not quite there yet. But when we have the Hasmonean kings ruling in Jerusalem, who are now fulfilling all of their ritual commandments, life seems to be good, except what we don't often pay attention to in the Hanukkah story is that the Jews were victorious only within a very limited realm. Right? Meaning that you are now the Hasmonean king of Jerusalem. You wake up in the morning, you look out onto the horizon, and who do you see? The Greek army. They're still there. And now they're really pissed off. Right? So you are ready, or you need to be ready for the next conflict. Because now it's going to keep going. Right? You sort of have started a trend. It's going to keep going, except with all of your local wisdom, you are going to think, okay, maybe I need a plan B. What if things don't go well for me next time in Jerusalem? Do I have any local advantage since we're playing in my home court? So, what does Judea have that Greece does not have? Desert. Right? Just literally, as we kept seeing on multiple occasions, out the back door of the city, right? You don't need to even go that far to get into the desert. And so one of those Hasmonean rulers, a guy by the name of Alexander Yanai, comes into the Judean desert, scouts out a location, and notices that this particular cliff, which we will see as we walk around, is distinct from the rest of the plateau. Which means that when you're up here, you literally have 360 degrees of defense, because there is no easy way up this mountain. And so he decides that this is going to be a desert retreat, a desert fortress. Okay? And that is why it's called metsada, which comes from the Hebrew word literally meaning fortress. It's not a very creative word, right? It's not a name that he applies. It's literally just a description. Why? Because Alexander and any of his world of, Maccabee rulers, they don't want to be here. Because if you're here, what's that a sign of?
You're on the defense.
Yeah, exactly. You're losing. Something went wrong. Because really, your whole story, your whole narrative is based in Jerusalem. So you want to be in Jerusalem unless something happens that maybe forces you out. At least you have a backup. You can come to Masada. You have maybe some troops here protecting you. You have resources waiting to feed you, your family, your generals, whatever you want to bring with you. And then as soon as possible, what do you want to do once you've regrouped, re-strategized? Go back to Jerusalem, right? There is no story here in the desert. There's nothing to protect. There's nothing to pass to the next generation. You want to be in Jerusalem. So I mention that because as we walk around Masada now, I will not be able to show you anything from the Hasmonean period. Because quite sensibly, they didn't invest, right? Why would you build lots of structures and bring all your stuff here if you don't ever want to be here? And it's possible that many of them never visited. It was just a backup plan. That forces us to fast forward now to the Roman Empire, right? The year 63, Pompey comes charging through the Middle East, just like Alexander the Great did a few hundred years before that. Pompey brings the army, the Roman army with him. From a Judean perspective, nothing changes, right? Same Hellenistic culture, same gods, just different names, right? Same culture clashes. Except now, as we move into the early Roman period, who's going to become king of Jerusalem? Herod. And what does Herod like to do more than anything else? Build stuff. Exactly. Doesn't really need a lot of excuse. So now we can look around, and as we start to walk in just a moment, everything, almost everything we're going to see on the top of this hill is Herodian. Does Herod have any more logical reasoning to build here than the Hasmoneans did? No. But Herod likes to build, right? It's part of his persona, and as we'll see, it probably features into his particular kind of psychological worldview differently than his Hasmonean preceders. Okay? So chapter 1, is the Greek period, right? The Hasmoneans who established this place. But given that they didn't really do much here, there's not a lot to see or talk about. So we're going to focus, at least in the next bit, on chapter 2, which is the Herod and the Roman Empire. Still a lot of the same conversation, a lot of the same tension and conflict within that Judean society. We'll touch on that. And then, of course, we'll eventually make our way to the third and the final chapter, which is what most people know about Masada, and that is sort of the big, dramatic end of the story, when the Jews are actually up on top of the Masada, and we'll sort of track who those Jews are, why they were here, because obviously it's going to be a little bit different than kind of the story of a leader coming here as part of a military re-strategizing. You with me so far? So it's a very short story, not a lot to sort of cover in terms of time, but it's a very, at least the second and third chapters are quite meaty. There's a lot to dig into. So that's what we'll do, but again, it all starts with the geography and recognizing that we're not that far from Jerusalem, and therefore this story is really a story about Jerusalem. It's not really a story about the desert. Questions? Thoughts?
Where did war happen in this area in Masada?
War?
Yes.
Well, let's just put it this way. There was a confrontation. I wouldn't call it a war, and you'll understand when we get to the end of the story. Because there was a confrontation, but it didn't end up being much of a battle, and you'll understand why. It'll become very clear. Other questions?
Talk about what we're looking at another point.
Yeah, we'll have a really good view from the high point, and I'll point out a few things that we can see. Yeah, unfortunately it's a little hazy, but we'll get enough of a view in. Absolutely. Anything else?
Water source.
Water source. Good question. Do you mean for you or for them? For you, there's a bubbler right over there.
No, I'm fine myself. But for the people who were up here.
Right. So obviously that is a challenge, right? Especially if you may sort of unintentionally end up spending some time here. Luckily, none of them planned on spending some time here, so it wasn't a tremendous concern, but you got to start with something. So we'll address that because we'll have a visual of it a little bit further on. When we get up to the top, I'll be able to talk about the water source.
So we're going inside the fortress. And this is Dan. These are the ruins of the fortress of King Herod the Great in Masada. This is the commandant's headquarters.
Okay? Don't run out of energy on me now. We just got started.
You've been here before.
Never been to
First time.
So far, so good. Yes, it's a timely joke.
Right.
It's a timely joke. This is shofar season. Okay.
Look at the view.
So like I said, we're going to focus a little bit on Herod, which we've talked about in sort of other circumstances. But just to appreciate the fact that most of the construction that we see of a Masada comes from Herod's desire to build up, right, the land, both the relevant areas and also some irrelevant areas. We don't know that this would have been counted among the relevant areas. We do know that Herod was actually here once. Herod was powerful. I don't know how much. We're also in Herodian days. We may have gotten just to sort of make sure we're all on the same page, when Herod, who grows up in this land, remember, right? He's from, I was telling you about how I was an archaeologist at Marasha. We think that that was Herod's hometown. So Herod grows up in this land, but he is not from Jewish lineage. He grows up in a family that is essentially an immigrant family from the southern deserts, right? Down in the southern area of Jordan, in the area of what we call Edom. His father was an Edomite governor. His mother was a Nabatean princess. And so he comes into the world sort of part of royalty, but displaced royalty, okay? But that means that he has good connections, at least as far as we understand from the texts. And so he is able to befriend some of the other powerful, figures at the time. Like we talked about, he becomes friends with Mark Antony and Cleopatra until, of course, he feels like they maybe are not going to be the victors in the internal struggles in the Roman world, and so he befriends Octavian, who eventually defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra and becomes Augustus Caesar. So Herod has a very quick rise, you could say, to authority, to power. He's able to convince the Roman Senate to appoint him to be king of Judea. However, he comes back to Judea, and there already is a king of Judea, right? It is the last king of the Hasmonean line, named Mattatyahu. And so King Herod, essentially goes to war against Mattatyahu in order to claim sort of the full-on right to the throne. And he wins, except that there is a moment of tension where he's afraid of some sort of reprisal, and so he actually flees Jerusalem, and he comes out into the desert, and he hangs out at Masada, right? He knows of Masada because it was a thing. It was a known thing because of the Hasmonean presence here, or at least establishment of the fort here before. So we know that Herod was here at least once. Ironically enough, given his defeat of the Hasmoneans, he then realizes that might not fly so well, right, within his Judean realm, because of course the Hasmoneans are the heroes of the Hanukkah story. So he is going to try to make nice, so to speak, by taking a Hasmonean princess as a wife, right? So Herod marries Miriam, all is well, they've sort of merged the royal families until they then start to have children. The children are now of the bloodline of the Hasmonean family. Herod is not. He becomes extremely concerned that his children, namely 2 sons, and his wife perhaps, are going to overthrow him in order to reestablish the Hasmonean dynasty. So he does what any good father would do. He kills them. Exactly. So this gives us a little insight into Herod's psychology, because a lot of the construction, a lot of the infrastructure that Herod sort of brings to Judea is going to have obviously a very, obvious element to it of just being big and beautiful and functional. But we're fairly certain that a lot of it is also about this kind of psychological barriers, right? Protecting himself because he is constantly fearful of somebody out to get him, including his own family. So that then helps us explain this model, right? What we're essentially looking at is the northern half of Masada, right? And you can see that he barely left a stone unturned. It is completely full of infrastructure, and we're now going to walk through and see many of these structures. So we're standing over here. These are the commander's residences. We're taking a guess at that because the areas are a little bit bigger, they're nicer, there's even a little bit of fresco on the wall. The soldiers' barracks were over on the other side, on the western side of the hill. There's a guard tower that has been reconstructed. You can see that right behind you. We're going to be walking through the 19 storehouses on Masada in this area just behind you over there, and we'll make our way over to the northern palace, which we'll see as it cascades down the edge of the cliff. If we have time, we might make a quick stop at the bathhouse before we make our way over to the western side and continue telling the story. In short, we can see that Herod filled much of the mountain with stuff, right? Some of it clearly functional, some of it maybe not so necessary. What's really fascinating, of course, is that as we look at the northern side of Masada, you can see that there's not much mountain left, right? It's all covered with stuff. But look at the southern half of the hill. What do you notice?
More empty.
Yeah, it's more empty. There's not much going on down there. So why would Herod be so obsessed with building up half of Masada and not the other half? Anything psychological maybe going on there? Sorry? Jerusalem. You cheated. You know this already, JP. Yes, we are facing Jerusalem to the northwest, right? Meaning that if Herod is here, more than likely an indication that something went wrong in Jerusalem, because obviously that's his power base, right? If he is here, there's probably somebody maybe coming after him, somebody going to challenge him, to threaten him. And so when they come over those cliffs, because remember, they're not going to follow our path, but they're going to take the direct route. So they'll come over that cliff and they will see the northern edge of Masada. And so this becomes perhaps psychological warfare by showing off your strength, your talents, your wealth, your resources, and maybe prevent somebody from thinking, I can do that, right? I can attack, I can conquer Herod. So it's quite possible that a lot of these structures are not quite as functional as we may have thought, but really just designed to be an imposing visual on anybody who might come to challenge Herod. Whereas from the south, you're certainly not going to expect anybody coming out of the middle of the desert with a grand army ready to conquer. Right? Kind of makes sense. So that's what we kind of glean from some of the archaeology here, that there is definitely some psychological warfare going on. Although, as we'll see, some of the buildings do have a function to them. I don't know how relevant they would be in the middle of the desert when there's probably not a lot going on here, but nonetheless. Questions?
What's the distinction of this one Masada to the Herodium?
What is the
distinction?
Distinction?
Yes.
I mean, on one hand, they're the same. They're just fortresses in the desert. On the other hand, clearly Herod had some plans for Herodian, as far as we know, right? And you were there.
Yeah.
That was where he wanted to be buried. Herod did not seem to have any plans for Masada. He was treating it just as those that came before him treated it. It was a what-if scenario. Things go bad in Jerusalem, you flee. Right? By the way, Herodian, we know, comes into the Herodian story.
Yes.
Yes, Herodium, the place, comes into the Herodian story because when he is fleeing Mattatyahu, Antigonus, who he defeated in Jerusalem, he is coming through the desert, which you might know, Herodian is right on that path, and his mother's carriage behind him flips over right around the spot where eventually Herod is to build Herodian. So in fact, the actual place of Herodian is largely connected to the Masada story because he's worried that maybe in between Jerusalem and Masada, as close as it is, maybe you need a way station, right? Just in case you have some issues along the way, like his mother had when they were fleeing. So that's sort of the connection, not a strong one. Good? All right, so we're going to keep walking around. You'll notice as we go, by the way, that there are lots of these black lines on the walls. That is simply a mark of archaeological integrity, admitting what we actually found, right, when we excavated here, versus what we rebuilt. Even though the rebuilding was often made with some of the original stones, nonetheless, we put it back into place to give you more of a visual experience. Otherwise, you have to wonder what would happen. Great question. The problem with answering it is that almost everything that we know how to do, you don't do simultaneously. Right? Meaning, rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, building the fortress of Josephus, building Sicarii, building Sebastian, building Herodian, building this, all taking place roughly at the same time. So on its own, maybe you could do this in like, I don't know, a few years, 5 years, something like that. But there was like a 20-year period essentially where everything was happening. So it's very hard to gauge like, individually. I can give you this because obviously he was probably either stretching, or pulling it quite thin, or simply forcing it.
Because you're dressed like him.
Is largely coming from pictures and also from tombs in terms of maybe not just the past.
You see? You're staring here.
Yeah, that would probably be the reason why the Great Report of Sicarii is to funnel all the commercial income into his bank account, right? As opposed to the more traditional ports, what was Jaffa and Akka, right? Where the ports sort of pre-existed. There was a sort of a secret place. Maybe from the Dead Sea, something. I don't know how much money you're getting from that. Well, okay, ready? Let's keep going.
And build the city, you need to think about all. About pleasuring, but more important about food. לא, רציתי להפריע, בגלל זה סליחה.
Potatoes or something like that, and you wrap it up, and you've got a very nice meal over there. Guys, why don't you all come on this side so that other groups can get by? Okay. And then, what are you going to drink with it? Wine. And then you can see my teacher very quickly if you come up with
Down there is the bathroom.
Side in the air. And then, of course, the caldarium is where you need a little bit of technology to help you out, because nature is not going to make the water hot enough to steam, and that we'll see when we head inside. Okay? So let's go in. We'll sort of squeeze in between the groups, and we'll see what we see. Usually, yes. Usually you go into the cold water, and then you wait for the
So we'll go inside to the bathhouse of the Roman Empire.
was Sicarii. Do. All right. Okay, the caldarium is where all the action happens in the bathhouse. This is kind of the whole point of the bathhouse, right? It's the steam room. Frigidarium is not that much fun. It cools you off a little bit, but really this is where the cool stuff happens. So again, water is not going to naturally get hot enough to be able to steam, so you need to help it. So behind me, through this hole in the wall, is the furnace, right? Every bathhouse has a furnace. You use whatever fuel you have. Obviously here in the desert, there aren't a lot of trees to supply you with wood, so what are you using for fuel? What? Asphalt. Not asphalt. Dung, exactly. Whatever poop you can get a hold of, even human poop. Eventually it'll burn. Back then they had better diets than we do today, so their poop was a little bit drier. Today, I don't even want to go into that. So you burn the poop, you create the hot air, you pump the hot air with the bellows underneath this fake tile floor. You can see it's being artificially raised up by the little small pillars, right? And so the hot air is then heating the water. Okay, so everybody just part the Red Sea, and Gila's going to bring her group and apparently walk through us at some point. So we have hot air underneath the tile. The water is on the tile, so it's heating up the tile to steam a little bit. We also have this recreated hypocaust clay pipes that are in the wall. You can see all the original indentations if you look at the plaster around you. And so that hot air is literally circulating the entire room, right? So it turns into basically a steam bath. Right? This is then where you want to hang out. As your pores open up, you kind of release all your toxins, you're relaxing, and you're hanging out naked with all of the other folks, right? In the caldarium. Right? Mostly men. We know that women used a bathhouse, but generally they didn't use it at the same time, right? Of course, that didn't have much of an effect on all the sexual activity that was taking place in the bathhouse, but that was the nature of the times. They didn't need names for it. It just, if it moved, it was sexable. Anyways, the point is that that was used as kind of like a battle front, meaning outside of the fortress you have sort of a I don't even know what word to use, like a warning tower kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so it was specifically placed there because this was seen as the most vulnerable approach to Masada, given that, of course, the plateau is clearly higher than the land, the elevation on the other side. But not only that, because of the natural escarpment, if you are going to try to run up the side of the mountain, you're going to choose this side, okay? So the Romans then take advantage of that and take that natural escarpment and build on top of it a ramp. Some of you can already see it. If not, you'll take a look afterwards. You don't have to fuss about it now. But there is a slope here, right, to my right, to your left, of rocks that looks a little bit too perfect to be natural, and that is because it is man-made. The Romans built this on top of that rock escarpment, and sort of, they created a wooden frame. We actually have some of the remnants of the wood, and they sort of filled it all in with rubble and rock, and they were able to then use that as a ramp so that they could take a wooden battle tower, attach it to the wall of the mountain with pulleys, and then yank it up the hill until it actually stood side by side with the actual wall. So we have a drawing of it. It looks something a little bit like this. It might be hard to see. You'll see it, maybe you can come up and see a little closer a little bit later. But this is just sort of an artistic representation of the battle tower being drawn up towards the top of Masada. Okay? Again, most of this information coming into us from Josephus, right? Which, I should note, by this point in history, he's not even in the land of Judea, right? After the destruction of Jerusalem, he goes to Rome. He is adopted by the emperor's family, and he spends his remaining years living in one of the Roman palaces. So he's not even anywhere nearby when this story is taking place. But he does give us some very vivid detail, which also raises a lot of questions. How on earth did he know that stuff? Because he's nowhere to be seen. Point is, he tells us that the Romans build the ramp, build the battle tower, drag it up, and they get to work trying to plunge through the walls. Eventually the battering ram is successful, at which point, literally as the battering ram plunges through the wall, a fire breaks out. You are standing on a big tower of wood. That is not very good timing. And so, according to Josephus, the Roman soldiers decide to retreat for the night, knowing full well that the Jews will never be able to replace the wall that quickly, and they'll simply wait out the fire and come back up in the morning. So the Romans go back to their camps, right? The 8 camps around Masada, and now there's a big hole in the wall, and the Jews have to figure out what to do next. According to Josephus, again, right? The leader of the community at this time, not the same guy who dragged them out of Jerusalem, but the next generation leader, a guy by the name of Eleazar ben Yair, is going to gather the men of this 1,000 strong community and recite a very dramatic speech, which Josephus records word for word in his history book, as you do, exactly. So, did it happen? We're not sure. Josephus gives us a hint as to how he may have known this, which I'll share with you in just a moment. I just want to read you a few sentences of this very long dramatic speech so you can get a sense of sort of where the emotions come from and what's about to happen next. Since we long ago resolved never to be slaves to the Romans, nor to any other except God, who is the true and just God of mankind, the time has come that obliges us to make that resolution true in practice. We were the very first that revolted against Rome, right? Remember, they're zealots after all. And we are now the last ones standing to fight against them. I can only see it as a favor that God has granted us, that it is still in our power to die bravely and in a state of freedom. Let our wives die before they are abused. Let our children die before they have tasted slavery. And after we, the men, have slain them, the wives and the children, let us bestow that glorious benefit upon each other mutually. All our possessions except food must be destroyed, for the food will be a testimony when we are dead that we were not subdued for want of necessities, but that according to our original resolution, we preferred death over slavery. And with that, he sends the men back home to their families. The men kill the wives and the children, and they then gather again and, according to Josephus, draw lots to find who will be the last man standing, so that as they go around the circle killing each other, one of them is going to have to fall on his own dagger. Okay? During the archaeological excavations, I'll just share with you because it's kind of fun, in a room just outside of the bathhouse, we found a number of very small potsherds with names inscribed on them. It kind of looks like what Josephus describes as the lots that were drawn to see who's that unfortunately, last man standing. Of course, we have no idea if that's the case. What we do know is that this piece of pottery in the middle says Ben Yair, right? The name of the leader of the community that Josephus quotes. So it's certainly a possibility that some of the story may have played out the way that Josephus relates, given the very scant archaeological evidence of that particular moment. So we don't know for sure. What we do know is that Josephus continues telling the story, because obviously he's largely going to be telling it from the Roman perspective. The next morning, the Roman soldiers get up and prepare for attack. They come through the breach in the wall and prepared for battle, but it's really quiet. Everybody's dead. There's nothing to do. And so hence my response when somebody asked about the war. Was that you? No, that was you. The war at Masada, there really was no war. There was a preparation for war, but there was no battle because all the Jews were now dead, except Josephus tells us that there were 2 women and 5 children who sort of pop out of a cave, surprise, and they get captured by the Romans and brought home. So maybe they were the one who related what exactly transpired, right, with this dramatic speech and the mass suicide and the whole thing. One could wonder, how did those 2 women and 5 children escape this very communal agreement that we're all going to die, right, rather than be captured by the Romans? I don't know. It's a good question. We don't know for that for sure. Josephus certainly does not bother explaining that to us. Unfortunately for Josephus, he uses that exact same excuse for a different battle that he tells that takes place in the Galilee, where they also all committed suicide, except for 2 women and 5 children.
What year was that again? Sorry.
This is taking place in the year 73. The end of the Masada story is in the year 73, 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem, because the Romans were involved in many other battles and lots of different zealot outposts in the desert. Like I said, Masada is not even the last stand. There is one other just over by the Dead Sea that does not have a story to it, but we know that it was next in line. So as far as we are concerned, the story ends, right? There's nothing else to it. You kind of pack your bags, you go home, you're done, right? Except clearly the Masada narrative does not end there. What is fascinating to know, though, because most people don't realize this, is that nobody ever heard of Masada again until the 19th century. Why? Because Josephus wasn't exactly a commonly read book, right? He was writing in Greek. It was in the library, but it wasn't exactly, kind of mainstream reading material. So a lot of people weren't familiar with Josephus, and he's the only one who tells all of these stories. So maybe there were a few academics throughout history, but generally speaking, mainstream communities did not know about the Masada story, largely because there just wasn't anybody left to tell the story. Until we fast forward to the 19th century, the creation of modern Zionism, right? Believe it or not, Zionism is largely responsible for our awareness, not obviously the knowledge, but the awareness of Masada today, because part of that desire to reconstitute Jewish peoplehood and maybe build a Jewish nation, you're going to need some very powerful symbols in there. For better or for worse, some of the Zionist minds who knew of the story of Masada decided that might be the calling card of the movement, right? In terms of heroism, in terms of determination, in terms of passion, right? Commitment. And so they literally dragged the story out of the archives. They translate it into the languages that the Jews were speaking at the time. Eventually it gets translated into Hebrew as well. And so all the way through the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, we start to see this story circulate amongst Jewish communities in Europe and as they move towards Palestine. There are songs that are written about Masada. There are dances that are choreographed to the story of Masada, because it really is sort of almost like a forced narrative. And so as it's being adopted, right, people are sort of start to wonder, well, wait a second, why don't we go visit the place where Masada is? Except that nobody knew where it took place. So in the 1920s and the 1930s, you have all these pilgrimages of Jewish youth coming out into the desert, trying to figure out which hill is it, right? Eventually they realize it's this one. They're able to start the archaeological process. Clearly we've proven that this is Masada and not any of the other hills. 1948 comes along, the state of Israel is born. And the head of defense at the time, Moshe Dayan, you all might know him, the general with the eye patch, right? He decides that we're going to induct all the new soldiers, right, into the first Israeli military in 2,000 years on the top of Masada, right, to kind of bring this whole story full circle. And so there's this very kind of proud moment where you're inheriting that history and, taking up arms to defend the Jewish people. Then, of course, all the tourists start to come, and a lot of Jewish families, as you might know, there was a tradition of celebrating your child's bar bat mitzvah here on Masada, right, as a way of kind of continuing that story. And then something interesting happened, right? And with this, we're gonna wrap up. I promise. We're getting towards the end. Starting in the 1980s, early 1990s, right, we're 40, 50 years into the state of Israel. We don't need symbols and shouts and songs and dances as much as you used to, because you're not necessarily sort of fighting to create something. You already have that thing. There is a Jewish nation. There is a Jewish army. All right, you have some challenges, but you exist. So people kind of chill out a little bit. And what happens is annoying nudnits like me start to reread the story, and you start to look at the details of the story. Is there anything interesting about this story that might kind of cause some discomfort amongst the masses of Jews who've embraced the Zionist narrative?
Murder, suicide.
What?
They didn't fight to the death.
They didn't exactly fight to the death, right? Although you could argue that they took a very brave path, of saying that if we fight, we might lose. We don't really want to die at their hands. We'd rather die at our hands. But there's one thing that's really critical to understanding the Masada story, and that is that there's no continuity. They're done, right? They made a choice. We are ending our community identity here. So as the inheritors of Jewish history, right, me and any other living Jew today, we can't really say we're a descendant of the Sicarii because their story ends with a thud, right? So if we're trying to embrace something, maybe we should appreciate the fact that there were other Jews with other stories that weren't as aggressive or violent, who actually survived the revolt because clearly somebody must have passed down Jewish identity so that it could get to the Zionists in the first place, right? And so as you reread the story and you realize that this is kind of gruesome, not only that, but think about why were the Zealots, this particular group of Zealots, here in the first place? What did I tell you about their past?
Separate from the rest of the Jewish people.
Yeah, not only separate, but violently separate, right? Meaning the whole reason they left Jerusalem is because everybody hated them, because they solved all their conflicts with violence and death. Is that really the kind of Jew that you want to emulate and sort of put up on a pedestal? And so throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, we start to see a retelling of the Masada story. Obviously, we're not going to pretend it didn't happen. Clearly, the archaeology, the views, everything is important. But how do we relate to it, I think, is a very interesting question. So to end, I just want to share with you a very brief poem that I think expresses something very fascinating about the way, and I'm sure you can think of parallels in your own communities, right? Your own national identities, things that are often feel very romantic and very poignant, and then sort of you look at them up close and you start to think, wait a second, right? That's a little awkward. So here's a poem I think that kind of summarizes all of that and gives us a sense of maybe how we often should be constantly aware of how we read our history and how we tell our stories. So there's a very famous Israeli poet by the name of Meir Wieseltier, and he writes about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, something like that. So here it is, very short poem. The year is 71 of the Common Era. My son, don't run and join the Sicarii sect. Don't listen to Ben Yair's mad ravings. Don't take your wife and children to a desert clifftop, and don't conceal daggers in the folds of your cloak. Take your delicate wife and your tender children and go get a house in Lod or Yavne. Rome rules from Spain to the border of the Euphrates, but it is a Torah of life. You shall live by it, not by death. So essentially here, it's a commentary, right? That we have this very powerful story, but do we need to live by it? Probably not. Because it's not the kind of community, not the kind of Jewish life that we want to really emulate, especially now that Zionism clearly succeeded, at least to a certain extent, right? Obviously, we got a lot of problems in Israel, but we have a Jewish state. It's a relatively safe place for Jews to live. So maybe we celebrate that by embracing some of the positive aspects that come from our ancestors and our history, not the crazies that were literally on the far fringe of society that all the other Jews hated, right? And then at the end of the day, they decide no continuity, right? We're literally ending everything now. And so they offer nothing in terms of, the genetics of Judaism to the future. And clearly, if Jews are here today, maybe we should be looking at other examples of heroism, determination, and whatnot. And the hint that you may have not picked up on in that poem, when Wieseltier says, go get a house in Lod or Yavne, do any of you know the significance of those two towns?
Well, Yavne was where they reconstituted Judaism.
In what form?
To the Pharisees?
Yes, specifically rabbinic Judaism, right? Yavne was the first place where the Jewish rabbinic authorities
It's kind of hot up here right now because it's almost 11. But it's a beautiful view, and I hope you enjoy the history of Masada. So more videos to come. Thank you for watching. God bless you all, and have a wonderful day.
I'd like to say I just work here, but I don't.
Herod, what's the name of the monastic
We don't have any.
community? No name.
No name.
I
We, like I
see.
said, we know almost nothing
I see.
about this place, other than the fact that we can see, from the building that this is not Herod. It's much later. It's
I
obviously
see.
Christian. That's all we know. We know almost nothing. Almost nothing.
So this is the monastic church after Herod died.
There's a beautiful mosaic here on the left.
The technology in concrete changed from the time of Herod to the time of monks?
Not so much.
אתה עומד
I
שם
mean-
עם הקבוצה? מדריך.
כן.
אתה עומד עם הקבוצה שם?
לא, אנחנו פשוט
בסדר,
עוברים.
לא, אני לא רוצה להפריע לך.
לא, תודה רבה, באמת. מוזמנת, בשמחה.
So once again, thank you for watching. And here is the full view of Masada and the Dead Sea. Bye. Adios, shukran.
It's like your access.